Welcome to the Salience Podcast, where we identify what stands out from all the noise.
Our guest today on the Salience Podcast is Michele Wucker. Michele is the international best-selling author of Grey Rhino. A grey rhino is a metaphor for a highly probable, high-impact, yet neglected threat. Whereas the elephant in the room is the big obvious problem that everyone avoids talking about, and the black swan is an improbable and unforeseeable extreme event, ignore a charging rhino at your peril. The metaphor for Grey Rhino is now recognised in dictionaries as a term for risk, and her book is the #1 best-selling English language book in China. And from all accounts, her work is shaping China's planning and policy. I'd like to return to that later in our interview when we consider the influence of culture on salience, and especially what people detect and whether or not they respond. In many ways, Michele's work has spanned the continuum between weak signals through to grey rhinos. In our most recent book, Resilience by Design, we referenced Michele's important contribution to the animal metaphors for risk. I also had the pleasure of meeting Michele last month at a workshop for Tasmanian leaders on risk and leadership. I was speaking about risky business in complex systems, and Michele beamed in from Chicago to be interviewed about grey rhinos and her latest book, You Are What You Risk. Michele's interview was fantastic, and I'm pleased that she's agreed to be here today to share her perspectives on salience. So, Michele, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here.
I'd like to dive straight in with questions about Grey Rhino and then move towards your later work. The Grey Rhino, I think, is just a fantastic metaphor. And in the introduction, you note that the problem is not so much weak signals, but weak responses to signals. And that there's a reluctance to see and act on warning signs. And I'm really curious, what are people and organizations doing instead? You know, is it like the guerrilla experiments with radiologists that they literally look but don't see? Are people sticking their heads in the sand and making sure that they don't see? Or are they doing something else entirely? So what's going on?
It's all of the above. I think different people are guilty of different things and different versions. And in fact, that's what the newer book goes into in more detail, how this varies among people. There's been a lot of work in behavioral science, behavioral economics, as you know, for the recent decades. And that looks at these biases that we have, or heuristic sort of shortcuts that our brains take. And those are hardwired into us. They're ways to protect us from information that's just too scary that we can't manage if we absorb it all at once, or they're ways to make mental shortcuts, or they're social strategies. And so there's all sorts of biases. One of them is the optimism bias, that we absorb information that we want to hear, and we sort of push aside what we don't want to hear. There's confirmation bias, which is we are more open to information that affirms what we already know. There's groupthink, which is when you have people around a table, and particularly the more they look and think alike and come from similar backgrounds, when one person says something, it makes it much more likely that everybody around the room is going to say the same thing. And the more homogeneous the group is, the stronger that effect is, which means you don't get alternative viewpoints. There's a solution aversion, which is if you don't like what you have to do to solve the problem. Climate change is a great example of this. You say blah, 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 blah. I don't want to hear about it. So there's all sorts of mental tricks that we play on ourselves, but there are also external factors, which might be in a company, how the CEO and how other people at the company are compensated, that it might be the wrong incentives. Or you look at political systems in democracies where it's in the interest of an elected official to sort of kick the can down the road and let it blow up when the other person is in office, instead of making a short-term difficult decision that ultimately is going to mean less pain down the road. And then we also have manufactured denial, which is people who know the problem is there, but have a vested interest in letting the problem continue in the status quo. And so they try to basically prey on all of these cognitive biases that we have and encourage people to not pay attention to it. That said, some people do pay attention. With climate change, we see so many people out there who've dedicated their lives to trying to change the path that we're on.
Mm.
And so the point of the Gray Rhino is really, there's some people see the big, scary, dangerous thing coming at them and they stand up and do something about it, and other ones don't. But we're not condemned to ignore it. And I'm a little bit rueful about the way we described it. Initially in the book, there's a big, obvious probable was how I originally talked about it. Dynamic, it's coming at you. And we circulated the book around US editors, and nobody wanted to believe that we're not already paying attention to obvious things. They said, oh, this isn't counterintuitive. And I went, whoa, this is so counterintuitive. You don't even know it's counterintuitive. So we started to sort of emphasize the neglected and ignored part of it, which turned out to be a bit of an overcorrection. And so often I'll see, particularly in some Western media, this idea that the Gray Rhino is coming at you and you're going to get trampled, which wasn't my intention at all. That really the impetus for it was looking at some examples of people who do something and examples of people who don't, trying to figure out why, so that we can take those lessons and do better at dealing with other Gray Rhinos.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking there. I was thinking about my own personal biases. What do I do with these big obvious threats in my life that are heading my way? And I just sort of thought about my personal bias. I suspect is the tomorrow bias. I'll get to this tomorrow. I know it's coming. And linking back to your second book, if you think about personalities and your preferences for risk, I'm one of those people that works really well under lots of pressure. And using the rhino metaphor, I'd almost be smelling its breath and feeling the nostrils flaring right in front of me before I step sideways and go, woohoo, right, now we're going to deal with a rhino. So I'm kind of one of those people. I wonder, what do you like with the rhinos? Where are your biases? What do you like to do?
Well, it's interesting. It's certainly changed the more work I do on these questions, the more attention I pay to Gray Rhinos. And different parts of my life, I'll have very, very different reactions. And I've also become aware of what makes me more comfortable or less comfortable and how I weigh things, because often you've got two things coming at you. There's your health, because you're stressed out and working long hours and don't have a life outside of your job and it's making you sick. So that's the one thing. And, on the other side, there's what are you going to do with your career? And then the health ends up affecting the career as well. And so you've got to, at some point, prioritize these Gray Rhinos. And it's something I talk about in the diagnosing chapter of the book. It's that, can you solve this particular Gray Rhino by just dealing with it? Or is there something further up the food chain that you've got to deal with? Or is there something further down the food chain that fixing this will help? And so I've thought a lot about my personality, particularly as I was writing You Are What You Risk, which is all about variability in personality. So it's not just the stage of the event, which was the focus of the first Gray Rhino book, but it's why each person's personality affects things. And there's a great tool that I talk about in the book called the Risk Type Compass, which is developed out of the UK, a group called Psychological Consultancy, and they have it looks like a compass pretty much, and there are two axes with 4 poles and 4 in between points, but it basically looks at how calm or anxious you are in face of a risk and how methodical or impulsive you are. And I find that I tend to be quite methodical, although much like firefighters or other people who practice things, once you're methodical enough times about building up that risk muscle, you can then act very quickly. It's arguable whether it's actually impulsive or not, since you've created a real foundation for it. And then in terms of anxious or calm, I wouldn't say anxious, but obviously excited. I mean, like my whole life right now is talking about risk and thinking about risk and helping people to deal with it. And so I actually did this test. My risk type came up as mildly intense. And I absolutely just love the contradiction within that, because I love contradictions. But, intense means I pay a lot of attention to this kind of stuff. And it's like my dog. She'll get excited, and sometimes it's a scared excited, and sometimes it's just a excited. I want to play kind of excited. And that's probably more the, I want to play kind of excited that I feel when I'm looking at risks. But I'm also very methodical about it. And the mildly part of it refers to how stuck I am to one or the other of these poles. And by mildly, it means I'm towards the center of this compass, which means I've got a lot of empathy for the other points on the compass. And that also makes a lot of sense, given what I've decided to do for a living. And I realized that probably a big part of why I'm so obsessed with this is that my parents came from two hugely different families with completely different approaches to risk. I mean, my dad's parents had everything planned for their funeral, like everything but the dates chiseled into the stone, the menu for the funeral. It was so organized. It was amazing. And of course, my mom's mother, let's just say, was not the same. And we'll leave it at that. But so when I grew up, there were completely different attitudes towards what time do we need to leave to get the place where we're going. They ended up often having to take two cars because they couldn't agree on what time to leave the house to get to church. And so that sort of constant struggle about what's risky or what's not, I do think really shaped what I ended up doing professionally.
Yeah, interesting. This idea of a risk muscle, and in your later book, you introduce a whole new vocabulary around risk, which I found really good fun and really helpful. And this idea, I mean, thinking of the book title, "You Are What You Risk," and then you go to the later points and about how you can train yourself to view risk differently, to respond differently. And I'm drawing a few threads together here with what you just said as well about this balance between anxious and calm, and family influences on how you perceive risk and organization, and that sort of methodical, or in your case, mildly intense compass. And I think a lot of what we've been doing in Frontline Mind is very much focusing on what I'd call calibration. And training that risk muscle to respond appropriately, and redistributing risk, which is both that sort of emotive, that felt sensation, and the rational. So we work a lot with frontline operatives, quite often with people that are very unwell. They've got hypervigilance or having a traumatic stress response, or they've got anxiety that's off the chart, and in fact it's not proportionate to the risk around them. And we train them how to recalibrate that, how to detect signals early, how to calibrate out the salient information from the things that they're overreacting to. So it's a recalibration activity as much as anything. And I say that because, this stuff is eminently trainable. This risk muscle that you described is really, really trainable. And then you've got this sort of paradoxical relationship with you are what you risk. So your personality, your behaviors inform your approach to risk, but you can train your approach to risk, which by definition then changes your ability to self-identify, to have this idea of personality. So I've just sort of thrown open this huge relationship between, what is personality, what's identity, and how does risk relate, given that it's all changeable. So I'm going to throw an open comment to you. What do you make of all of that? That's a really broad question.
Sure. Well, this bit about identity is, really my argument is that the world sees who you are through the risks that you take and the chances that you take. And I've read, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've read that we take 35,000 choices every single day. So that's 35,000 risks that everybody takes every day, but we don't think about risk taking when we're making decisions at all. And the choices that you make are as distinctive as a fingerprint at a crime scene or, in a biometric pass at the airport. It's a unique identifier of who you are, that the imprint that your choices make. But then, like a real fingerprint, there are lots of influences behind that imprint. And those involve the things that you can't change, as you mentioned, your innate personality, your genetics. There's 124 genetic markers that affect risk taking. There's a lot of controversy still about exactly how all of that works, but part of it is something you can't change. It's who you are. You've got to understand that and live with it. And the second part is your upbringing, your experiences. It's a lot of things that you have no control over. Although as you get older, you have some more power to put yourself in certain situations or not. And whether those situations work out for the better or for the worst becomes part of this feedback loop and this learning process. And people of different innate personality types will respond very differently to uncertainty, to big shocks. It's interesting in the book, I spoke with some people who went through some huge shocks. And some people, I talked with the adult children of some Holocaust survivors, and their parents became very, very conservative and wanted their children to be very conservative. Do everything you can to try to control life as much as possible. Or I talked to the CEO of a Central American conglomerate, who was 40-something year old friend of mine who had recently been given the reins, and huge differences between the earlier generations who had lost 75% of what they owned during the political conflicts in the 70s and 80s. And so they were all about preservation of capital. And the new generation was all about becoming obsolete and irrelevant, and the company just kind of slowly withering. So completely different attitudes. And then there were some other people, refugees, entrepreneurs who went through a really rough time. They got through the other side and they said, well, if I live through that, I can live through anything. And they actually became better at embracing risk and change and uncertainty. So that's the second part. And the relationship between your innate personality and what goes on, your experiences. And the third part, as you said, is what you can change. It's the habits that you create that, for me, start with self-awareness. Understand what your personality type is, what makes you more comfortable taking quote unquote good risks, investing in a business, investing in education, getting married, these sort of things that have the potential for a lot of good. And also what makes you more likely to step back and consider things before you take a bad risk. Marrying someone who's obviously a really bad choice, or, gambling, or, listening to your uncle's shoe shine person's stock tip, things like that. And so if you know that you're inclined to leap before you look, you can deal with that once you have the self-awareness. And so from there, you can change things in your life. You can go to a different job that's better suited to your particular risk personality. You can surround yourself with a mix of people. And I always do recommend, a mix. Some people who are more adventurous and other ones who are much more prudent. And then you can also do things like control your environment on the days when you're making risk decisions. You look at biometric indicators, just like traders do. They pay attention to what their body is telling them when they're about to put a lot of money on the line. And there's some crazy things I found out, like the temperature in the room, the lighting, the color of the paint. The craziest thing for me was spicy food. I mean, if you've eaten spicy food, then for the few hours afterwards, you're more likely to take bigger risks than not. So you can set up the environment to optimize for your personality. And there's no ideal personality. It's more being aware of who you are and how your experiences have shaped that. And from there, what kind of decision can you make that ends up with the highest odds of you making the right choice?
What sort of signals or behaviors stand out to you that would alert you that the crowd is going in the wrong way?
That's a great question, and of course, it depends on the situation. But I think anytime you get extreme sentiments, you'll see this greed and fear index on Wall Street. Um, if people are at extreme greed, then that's probably a good time to sell. If it's extreme fear, it's probably a really good time to buy. There are other indicators like margin interest. How much people are borrowing in order to put money into the stock market, or short interest. How much they're spending to bet that the market's going to go down. Those are some of the indicators. You've got people who look at the market technicals, and then you've got people who actually look at the fundamentals of the economy and compare earnings, price earnings ratios to where the stock market is, or who track the Fed balance sheet correlation to the S&P. So you can find a lot of indicators both on where the economy is likely to go and where it is. And whenever you see too big of a gap, this is a pretty important sell or buy signal, depending on which direction the gap is going.
Yeah, interesting. So what I'm taking there is looking for extremities or extreme sentiment, and it's really drawn my attention to something we've been placing a lot of attention on, which is dichotomies. It's a good or a bad. It's a strongly this or a strongly that. It's the relationship between, is it conscious or unconscious responses to decision? And what we're doing is looking very much about how do we bridge the gap? How do we come back into the middle where it's not an either or, it's paying attention to the and. And if you've got an extreme of anything, then you probably know, hey, there's a problem here. Where's the balance? Where's the check? Where's the counterfactual? And I think that really gets to the heart of risk for me. And I'd like to say I use that metaphor, the heart of it, deliberately. I didn't, but it's very relevant. Where we're balancing up the rational, the evidence, the potentially statistics, and also the heartfelt, the gut felt, the embodied sensations for risk, and in complex systems, that's really where we go, where it's happening too fast. You don't have time to do a computation. Your rational brain's overloaded, or you're fatigued, and you've got to rely on those more instinctual responses. And I think one of the things that we've made a small nudge in the right direction, but I think we've got a lot further to go, which is that relationship, the dynamic relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, and how we can improve that relationship and how we can improve training our unconscious responses. I wonder if you've got anything to comment on that.
Yeah, it's really important. It goes back to some of the physiological, neurobiological responses that I was talking about. And I think that, and traders already use this quite extensively, is that, understanding what mood you're in, if you're hungry or cranky. There's some research showing that, judges are harsher with their sentences. I forget if it's like right before lunch when they're hungry, or, right before dinner, but, their physiological state affects how harsh they are or not. We've got all sorts of biases towards different groups of people. So I think being aware of the biases, being aware of your state of mind. If something comes up when I know I am hangry, I will say, let's talk about this later after I've got some protein in my bloodstream. So being aware of that is important, and other things like how much knowledge you have over a situation, or how much control in organizations. It's very important to create this sense of psychological safety, where people can say, hey, have we thought about this? Hey, I'm a little worried. Hey, is this an opportunity that we're missing? Feeling confident about saying those kind of things, to be confident that you'll be heard and that you won't be punished for it. I think is important. And you can practice those things in structure, creating a structured debate setting in your meetings, practicing, role sharing. One day, one person's the devil's advocate. The next day, they're the angel's advocate, the person who always says yes. So I think we can do that. And I think also being conscious of our confidence level. I wrote about this a bit in the Gray Rhino, about the super forecasting project, Philip Tetlock and his team, where they in the good judgment project, which pulls together lots of forecasters. At the very beginning, you go through a number of exercises where you make a prediction and then you say how confident you are of your prediction. And the more you do it, the closer your confidence level gets to the actual situation, which says that you can train that, you can calibrate your confidence level. And there's a lot of research showing that overconfidence can lead to really bad decisions. And also, some groups are more likely to be overconfident of their ability to control a situation or to solve a problem, which means they're going to take more risk than is appropriate. There are some other people who will underestimate the cost. I think both of these were true of a lot of the car makers with some of the safety scandals that we've seen. They underestimated the potential cost, and they also underestimated the likelihood that people were going to die. So that's another area. We can, we'll intellectualize things. We'll come up with reasons why it's not that serious, not that big. Not coming up that soon, as you were saying before. You're all thinking, we can put this off. So lots of little tricks. And if you keep track of the kinds of decisions that you make and how they turn out, you can start seeing patterns in your own decision making. And maybe it's working with a coach or someone who can help you to identify those patterns. And once you're aware of those, you can learn to take 10 deep breaths, or you can learn to put the decision off for a day. You can learn much better habits, or you can learn who you can turn to get the information that you need to make the good decision. Because often people think they know more than they do. They do their own research, as we say in the States. So it's just, it's being aware of your tendencies and then doing what science shows helps to counteract them.
I really like this idea of keeping track and this calibration of the relationship between confidence and competence. As a coach, I'm often approached and people say, "Oh, I'd like more confidence," and the first place I go is, let's explore your competence and what evidence you have for your competence. And sometimes there's a bit of a gender bias in here as well. Often women will say, I'd like more confidence. And the place I go is, well, let's look for the evidence for your competence. And there's often a really good evidence trail, which we can then use to go, here's some of the social nonsense that you're paying attention to that's not evidence-based. And here's some of the stuff that we can use to underpin your development of confidence. In a really simple way, I can teach people to be confident in about 10 minutes. That's super easy. But what you want is the confidence to match the competence. Wonder if you've got anything to add as a final close for those risk addicts out there that choose risky things to do, or perhaps that are not aware that there are some potentially unhealthy patterns in their decision making or risk taking. Have you got any advice for them? And I'm a risk addict. There's no question about that. I love it. Any advice for me?
Well, it's actually interesting in the chapter on the neurobiology of risk. There's a bit on smokers and the risks that smokers. If you're a smoker, you're more likely to take risks on the job and get paid less to take those risks. But in the job that's inherently risky itself. So there's definitely a correlation there somehow. But I think there are ways to get past it. I think people who are experienced in addiction could probably tell you much more. But to me, it makes me think of early on in my career where I was a police reporter and then was writing about the trading of emerging markets debt. And also spent a lot of time in places like Haiti. And I found that writing about things, I needed a bigger and bigger story or like emotional hit to stay excited about what I was doing. And I finally realized and this was one of the first real-time news services. And so people weren't doing that all the time the way they are now. And I would write a story and I'd watch the prices of bonds go up and down at hundreds of millions of dollars created or destroyed in seconds at the stroke of a keyboard. And at some point, I just decided this isn't what I value the most. And I think that's probably the key in beating addiction, in making better risk decisions, is that when you understand what's most important to you, when you understand what your purpose is, where you're making the most contribution, put that front and center and say, I am not going to put that at risk. And if it's the day trading addiction or whatever kind of addiction that gets in the way of it. So it goes down to just strengthening your core, knowing who you are and why you're here and what fulfills you, I think helps you to see all the risks, to weigh the risks in your life very differently, just as people are doing right now with their jobs, quitting jobs all over the place because it's there are other things that they're putting at risk by staying at jobs with abusive bosses.
Yeah, fantastic. You've really gone full circle to your second book here around you are what you risk, and something as simple as that reflection of putting what's most important to you front and center can dramatically change your behaviors, your risk taking, your whole life, and by extension, this idea of personality and how you self-identify. As you were talking, I was reflecting on my co-author, Mike Weeks, in our book, Resilience by Design. He began as a professional climber, free soloist. He climbed very, very hard, climbs that were fatal. One slip and you're gone. And at the birth of his first child, he completely reframed what was important to him. And he stopped free soloing. He climbs with ropes. He's still a very, very good climber. But this whole idea of I'm a free solo climber just disappeared. I mean, he's still a cracking risk taker, and we have a lot of fun. We'd have a pretty similar risk appetite, I'd say, if you can use that term. I think that particular point there, put what's most important to you up front, and then think about that, just extending back to that idea of 7 generations. Think about the future and all the connectivity. I think that's where I would summarize and wrap up some really important takeaways for me from today's conversation.
I love the way you've pulled it all together. It's really beautifully done. It's been so great talking with you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Salience Podcast. Please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Frontline Mind newsletter by visiting our website at frontlinemind.com. Have you got a topic you would like some more salience on? Send us a message on LinkedIn or email team@frontlinemind.com.